Hey, what's up, Developing Workers crew? My name is Dave Shrine, and we are here talking with Matt Swartz about developing workers, what God has been doing in the last several months, not only in the ministry, but also in Matt's life specifically. So, Matt, thanks for taking a few moments to come
Hey,
and just share what God's been
not a
doing.
problem, Dave. Glad to be here. Really excited to be on the Developing Workers team, too.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll talk a little bit about that because there have been some changes going on with you. You have not been for the last 20 years on the Developing Workers team.
This is true.
You were somewhere else and now you've moved, but I'll let you do the talking about that. Share with us the story there.
Yeah, so for a lot of people that may not know myself and my wife, Annalie, past 26 years, we've been serving in local churches, Wisconsin, California, and then the past 19 years with Sun Valley Community Church here in Arizona. And one of the things that I communicate to people all the time is when we entered ministry, I know that God used a very specific season to kind of draw us in. We were focused on youth ministry and loved it, did that for about 15 years. But when we got to Sun Valley, there was a growth spurt that happened there. And they asked me to actually step into the international role for leading everything that was happening internationally for Sun Valley. And one of the things that I look back in my life is what I began to see through that job change was just that globally, all the pastors I was working with, there was a very clear distinction between the accessibility that we had to training and to growth opportunities in the U.S. versus what majority world pastors had available to them internationally. And so as a part of my role, about 5 years ago, we started a movement called Foundations Global. Now, if you think of pastoral training, way I say it to people is it's probably one of those non-sexy parts of mission. So we think of like orphan care, and that's important work, and we need to do that. And we think about clean water, and that's important work. We think about starting new churches. Every one of those, though, needs a equipped, trained leader to manage those movements and those programs. So in other words, you can't have ministry that's happening and feeding orphans without somebody that is equipped and prepared to lead, not just the physical, but also the spiritual, the emotional. And so as we began looking at that, we saw that there was a need to begin training pastors, not to try to replace seminary, but the majority world pastors, they would say right now about only 1 in 10 pastors globally has any training. And so we're not trying to replace seminary. We're trying to go with the something is better than nothing philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
And so we started doing these 4 one-day workshops over typically about a year and a half to 18 months to just begin bringing in a discussion of if your strategy in reaching your community is based on just programs or on a sermon that you give on the weekend, you're probably never going to reach your community. And so for us, what we began doing is how do we help pastors begin seeing discipleship as the core of what they do and the leaders that they equip and train to do that, to do discipleship, so that they in turn can expand the ministry of the church. Well, the funny part of that, though, was this ministry, we were starting to train about 1,000 pastors a year, and Sun Valley wasn't paying me full time to train pastors internationally. I had 5 different roles as a part of my ministry. And so my wife and I prayerfully made the decision to step out in faith to go and make training of pastors this next season of ministry. So after 26 years in a local church, really our ministry now is trying to be pastor to pastors and leaders globally that really want to see their ministries have an exponential impact in reaching their communities. So it just so happened, right as I began seeking, Michael Parker and I reconnected, and I started describing to him what we were looking at doing, and it was just right at that point that Developing Workers was turning a chapter to grow into what now is this amazing movement, and the rest is history. And so for us, it was an amazing journey how God used ministry in the local church to ultimately grow in my heart a passion to see pastors and leaders globally equipped to be more effective in what they do.
That's very cool. And so now you are 100% full-time at Developing
Yep.
Workers, and something that you're having to do for the first time is raise your own support. Of course, in the U.S., a
Yep.
lot of times pastors, almost all the time, they're funded by the church themselves, whereas now the churches that you're going to,
Yeah, absolutely.
they don't have those resources, and so you've been connecting with partners and with individuals and others who
That's
are
right.
supporting the work you're doing directly. Do you have anything you want to share about that and how that's
Yeah,
been
absolutely.
going?
Well, first off, it's the greatest irony of my life. So I was a missions pastor for 12 years, and then I became a missionary and now raising support. So that's the greatest comedy of my life. Some of our international partners at Sun Valley have relished this idea. See, now you know what we're talking about here. So the exciting thing for us, we started in March raising support. As of August, we're at over 55% support raise of our fixed monthly support. So I'll tell you this, one of the things for us is I think the mentality coming in to raise support is I view it through the filter of I'm not asking people to just support Annalie and I. I'm asking them to support the pastors and leaders that we're equipping through our ministry.
Yeah.
And I think what we're ultimately trying to do is to paint a picture for people that everything that you care about in global causes, you have to also invest in those leaders. That's what we're asking people to invest in when they're partnering with us. So we just picked up another partner today. We're meeting with another potential partner this evening. So for us, we're excited. Our goal is by the end of the year to be at 100% support. If that happens, that would be right 8-9 months, which is extremely fast. And so we're cautiously optimistic of accomplishing that. But with how we've seen God working in this, I view it through a filter of this has been from beginning to end a leap of faith. And we just have seen God continue to catch us in the process. It's been amazing.
That's very, very cool. Yeah, Sandra and I, we've been supporters of Developing Workers from day one when Michael launched out and kind of didn't even know what Developing Workers was going to look like. And it's been a great reward to come alongside the ministry and see how it's developed, see how it's expanded, and, you know, even seeing how now it's taken on a whole new shape outside of what he had originally planned. So you are now full-time, and you really didn't it's in line with a lot of what you were doing, but you didn't waste time in getting super busy. You've been traveling quite a bit, and you're going to be traveling quite a bit. So before we talk about the future, why don't you tell me, just give me a real quick snapshot of what the last couple months have looked like and the people that you've engaged with, and maybe throw in one or two stories that it's just like, yeah, this is why I continue to do this. This happened, and it just showed me, like, yep, keep going.
Yeah, so one of the things I think it's important for people to understand is I'm not the only trainer with Foundations Global. There were 10 of us that came in this transition to Developing Workers. So we have been working in Peru, in Mexico, in Panama, in Nicaragua, in Guatemala, in Costa Rica. So we have been really busy over these past 5 years in what's already been happening. So it's very different. If you look at a startup as Developing Workers, probably be considered by most people, when you look at what was already happening with the medical ministry, it was already happening with Foundations Global, it created this really fascinating situation where Developing Workers came out of the chute with all cylinders just running full steam ahead. I think it's been interesting for some people because they see me as being new at Developing Workers, but not realizing that this has been a ministry with Foundations Global that we've been doing for 5-6 years now. And so if you look at that, how could you guys possibly, as of today, we are at already for this year, 857 pastors trained for just this year alone. And we're not even done. We're just midpoint through the year. And so I think some people ask, well, how can that be? And it's because of the work that was already happening. So for us, some big areas where we see God at work is last year we launched in Mexico City, and that's been a 5-year dream for us. Mexico City is one of the 10 largest cities in the world. And when you realize that its draw and impact is not just for Mexico, but all throughout Central and South America as a hub of people that are coming there because of ease of accessibility, but it allows us the opportunity to be in one city but impact multiple countries. And so last fall, we met with a key leader there and launched with our first training center last fall. 2 different training centers that were happening. And what that then allowed for us is it opened a doorway because of that training center to begin also training in Acapulco. We're now finishing up in October the final initial workshop. But when we go back, we will be launching yet another training center there with the opportunity to meet with all the main evangelical leaders and denominational leaders in Mexico City to talk about other training centers that could begin to happen.
That's really
So
cool. I'm going to
us,
interrupt you real quick. I do want to know, when you say training center, can you just help me understand what you mean by a training
absolutely.
center?
So for us, when we talk about a training center, it's anywhere from 10, 15, 20 to 100 pastors that are coming. Their commitment, what we ask for them, is to come 4 times for 1 day over the course of the next 15 to 18 months. And so from that standpoint, we're not saying, hey, come for a week of training. We do 4 one-day workshops. And so that training center is typically in a geographical location with relatively easy access of less than an hour, ideally. Sometimes it's more, but for pastors and leaders in that area. And so typically a pastor may come by on their own or bring some of their key leaders with them. And so when you look at some training centers that may be 60, 80, 100, those tend to be in larger urban centers. When you look at some of the smaller ones, that may be in either a smaller area or a rural area. But for us, that training center, the vision is not that they would come and just get information, but they would actually implement, begin discipling their people, begin using it as a tool to plant other churches, to learn how to care for their own soul, and to learn how to study the Bible effectively.
That's very cool. So the training center that you launched in Mexico City wound up giving way to additional opportunities. You want to go into the additional opportunities and some of what has developed since then?
Absolutely. So for us, when we look at in a place like Mexico City, it's ideal to not just, hey, we go do one round of workshops and then we kind of step out. There's just such a population base that we began a discussion with our key leader there, who just recently became the head of the Evangelical Alliance for the country of Mexico. And so part of that shift in his role has opened up a new opportunity for us as we approached him and said, hey, we'd like to see more training centers. And so ultimately what's exciting is he's becoming the liaison to open up those new opportunities, whether it's through other denominations, other pastors and leaders. And what's fascinating is his response to us at the last time that we were there is, I'm excited to see this expansion happen because now I see that what you guys are training actually works.
Yeah.
And so this is 3 workshops in, and there's a confidence in him that this works, and I see the value of it, and I want other pastors to experience it. Because again, for us, I think that when we look at pastor training, we want it to be something that's not just helpful for them information, but something that they can actually tangibly apply. So we go do workshop 1, and workshop 1 is how do you do personal discipleship? Well, let me ask you this. Like, if I say discipleship to 20 different people, that can mean 20 different things.
Yeah.
And so literally what we do in that first workshop is we give them a definition of discipleship being intentionally meeting with someone up close, personal, and over time to help them grow in their relationship with Jesus to lead others to Christ. And so even in giving them a workable definition, now we begin to say, the reason why I say up close and personal over time is because it's measured by the people that we invest in, not just the sermons that we preach or the programs that we run. So we're not there to say, like, stop preaching sermons and stop doing your programs or ministries. We're saying it's evaluating ministries and asking, where is it that we are helping people to grow in their relationship with Christ through personal discipleship. So it's really been exciting because for us, when we look at a leader that comes back to a workshop and says, well, I don't know if I'm being successful because I'm only meeting with 2 people. Well, for them, that may be the first time they have ever met with somebody personally in doing discipleship.
Yeah.
And so then we have the opportunity to celebrate with them of, like, you got it. But again, through their filter, because if it's this idea that it's got to be this program with hundreds of people, no, you go, you personally invest, and then train other people to do that.
That's very, very cool. That paradigm, I mean, that's a global paradigm in terms of, well, if I don't have this, or if that person over there has that and mine only looks like this. And Doug Fields, who has written so many books about youth ministry, he has in one of his books, Your First 2 Years of Youth Ministry, he says, when you compare what you know to be true about yourself with what you don't know about somebody else, you lose. And I just love that as much as that's a truth for any pastor overseas who's just now trying to get their hands into a true discipleship model of ministry, it's a message that's just as good and just as timely for us here in the States, especially if you're not working in full-time vocational ministry.
That's right.
You might think, oh, that's the work of the pastor. Oh, that's the work of the minister. When
That's
in
right.
reality,
Yep.
the minister and the pastor is actually surrounded by more people who know Jesus than people who don't know Jesus, often in many different cases.
And so, for example, out of Mexico City, we launched in Acapulco. Now, Acapulco is completely unsafe for somebody that is my skin color to go.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as the pastor of this church, that's our key leader, as we were talking through it, the decision was, so my ministry partner, who I trained with in Mexico City, is originally from Mexico. And so the idea was, well, we'll have him go because he's Mexican. And so, like, he gets how to just be culturally aware of his surroundings to be safe. And we took one of the young leaders from the church that's going through our training with him. And so right now what's happening in Acapulco is a young leader that's going through our training in Mexico City turns around the next day and trains new leaders in Acapulco. So, I mean, think about this, that this guy who's 23 years old has now moved from just being a surveyor of the workshop to somebody that's leading and training others, and is learning how to understand how to develop leaders. And it literally learns it one day, teaches it the next day. It's amazing.
That's got to get you fired up.
Absolutely. Because I look at this guy and I see him not as the church of tomorrow, but the church of today. And he is now learning how to leverage influence in another part of Mexico just simply by making himself available to show up and grow in who he is as a follower of Jesus. It's amazing.
That's awesome. So that's North America.
Yep.
What about across the sea, across the ocean?
Yep.
And there was a trip that you did to Liverpool. Tell us a little bit about that and what's going on over there and why you were there and what happened when you were there.
Yeah. So one of the things that's interesting is obviously in my transition out of Sun Valley, there were two dynamics. One is that I knew well before I finished up I was going to be leaving. So I communicated, hey, I'm leaving in 6 months, and here's the 6 projects that I think I should finish up. In one of those projects, we have a young adult group that goes and serves with our global partners each year. This year they were serving in Liverpool and then in Poznan, Poland. And so for me, I felt like what I needed to accomplish as an employee of Sun Valley was going to be done right at about the end of April. But this group didn't leave until the end of May and got back in July. And so actually my wife and I went over to do the training and debrief in country with these young adults, which allowed two things to happen. One is obviously to finish out my role for Sun Valley, but what it also gave us is the ability to continue to connect with global partners that I knew as the missions pastor of Sun Valley to begin discussions of what are areas that we as developing workers could possibly serve you, and to begin taking those discussions forward. So, for example, beginning to look at with Liverpool, some of the questions that they look at is they have some needs with people that are coming and serving longer term over there, that they want specific ministry training for people, but they're completely maxed. And so these people are specifically going over to work within local churches. But again, as developed from an economic standard as Liverpool is as a part of the United Kingdom, it's a post-Christian society. There aren't the resources to say, hey, we're going to go to this workshop and seminar and to really train you in how to be more effective in ministry. And so for me, looking at it through the vantage point of being able to say, hey, as developing workers, we could help you guys. And so beginning those discussions of what are some areas of need to help them. And then jumping over into Poland, when you look at Poland, which is not post-Christian, but it's predominantly Catholic and really unreached, every major religious movement went around Poland. Just think about that for a moment. When you look at every religious movement that initiated globally, they all went around Poland. And so the fact of the matter is Poland is actually the most unreached country in Europe. And there's beginning to be this movement of change that's happening. But again, the change is happening as they're realizing they need a new model for how to reach people that are entrenched in a society that says to be Polish is to be Catholic. So you're not going to mess with their weekend church attendance.
Yeah.
But discipleship changes all the game. And so learning how to serve with them to help them understand what are ways that we can help you be more effective in discipleship. And so those are opportunities that are percolating. Who knows what will happen with it? But again, as I tell people, that the challenge for developing workers is not finding places that we could work, but to find the right opportunities for this moment that we should be moving forward with. We're not struggling to find places that are crying for us to come out and do training. We're struggling with prioritizing to say, how do we not overextend our reach and actually become ineffective in that? So praying through those opportunities for sure.
One of the things that I love about the Foundation's global model is it isn't a come to town, set up shop, close up shop, and move on to the next town.
That's
and
right.
Then you never see them again. It's a strategic, I believe you said it's a strategic 4 times over the course of 18 months, 24 months or so, that you say, no, like we're not asking you to commit to 1, we're asking you to commit to 4, because that's how we know we can get the material in your hands and it can begin to make a difference. And I really like that about the model, because it allows for those building of relationships, which is really where true life transformation takes place, is through ongoing relationship rather than,
Absolutely.
I mean, you said there's a time to do this, there's a time to do that. When I was younger, I went on mission trips and things like that, but did I return to the city? Not really. You're returning to the city. You're returning to the place where you already know people. Are you finding that is indeed making a large impact in the work that you're doing?
Well, yeah, because we have to remember, culturally speaking, relationships matter way more globally than they tend to in the U.S. So that's not true for every country. But especially like in Latin America, this idea of, hey, I'm going to come one time, I'm going to be the talking head for the day, and I'm going to leave, they'll get something out of it, but it probably won't be applied.
Yeah.
For us, the benefit as we come back is we are able to re-engage to create a platform for potential coaching. I think as I look in the U.S., it's very easy to find a pastor that could coach me and invest in me. Globally, that's not as easy. It just doesn't tend to be a part of the culture. For many churches globally, there's a high suspicion of interacting with another church. Maybe you're going to steal my people, or maybe you're going to undermine my ministry. And so this idea of asking for help is a low value.
Yeah.
And so part of what we're able to do is to come in, and we never come in with this superiority idea of, we've got it all great. Matter of fact, if anything, we ask them to not repeat the mistakes of what we've done in the U.S. In the U.S., we are very passionate about our programs. We tend to be very not passionate about discipleship. And so for us, the ability to say, you have the potential to do something even better than how the church in the U.S. is operating. And I think for many of them, they receive it because of our vulnerability of how we struggle in our own culture to actually apply this. What I do know, though, is what we're able to is paint a clear picture of this idea that we don't wait for people to show up at our doorsteps at the church. And so for me, sharing with them how I tend to intentionally reach out to people that are far from Jesus and walk through that whole process of them becoming a follower and then a reproducing disciple maker, it opens the mind to this idea of, discipleship isn't just about getting people to church, it's about bringing people to Christ. And that's a key difference in helping these leaders that are brilliant people. It's not that they're stupid, it's just been a lack of access to different thinking. And let's remember, this concept of discipleship is not a Western concept. It's a Middle Eastern rabbi that came up with this idea.
Yeah.
So, for me, when I go into any country, I'm saying discipleship flies in the face of every culture, because it even flew in the face of the Middle Eastern culture that Jesus was doing ministry in. Because discipleship is not based on strength, it's based on vulnerability. It's not based on information, it's based on application. That's huge in understanding that every culture is going to be offended by some aspect of discipleship. And that's okay. Let's just be honest about how we struggle within our own context as we're trying to train other people in their cultural context how to do this more effectively.
So that's where you've been. That's kind of what the last several months, last 6 months really have looked like for you. I know that you've got a couple more trips coming up before the end of the year, and now you're focusing, now with your work at Sun Valley being closed out and leaving well there, now you're able to shift gears and fully focus these next 6 months on developing workers and bringing the Foundation's global curriculum to more locations. You want to give us just a real quick heads up on where you're going and what you're doing, because I do know that we have already supporters who want to know these sorts of things, which is why we're doing this. But at the same time, we know that God is preparing in advance other partners to come alongside doing what we're doing with us, to do what we're doing, both financially and then to volunteer as well. So kind of just paint a picture of what this next season looks like, and then where there's opportunity for people to get involved, not just financially, but otherwise, paint a picture for that as well.
Yeah, so think about this in two senses. One is that you have to remember, for all the years that I was working at Sun Valley with our international partners, as I made my transition, my inbox started flooding with, hey, now that you're basically a free agent, here's my ministry. God loves you, and I have a wonderful plan for your life. So, which I fully expected. There's been a dear relationship that my wife and I have had with a ministry called Orchard Africa. I would say, as I look at the seed that was planted in my heart for pastoral training, it actually was planted in relationship with Orchard Africa. And that went all the way back to 2003, where I first met with them and began this relationship. And so for me, they were the first connection upon hearing about my transition at Sun Valley that said, what would it look like for you to come and launch what you're doing with Foundations Global in South Africa? And so as we began that discussion and dialogue, October 3rd through 5th, we will be doing 3 days of training, launching Foundations Global in South Africa, actually down in Cape Town, one of the largest slums of the world, Khayelitsha, is where we'll be doing that training. And so just excited for the opportunity to step out and to move outside of Latin America, which for us, God has blessed us with the training that we've been able to do, but we really believe that God loves not just North America and South America, maybe the rest of the world as well. And so for us to be able to begin, it's a launching pad for us. I'm excited about that, especially because I think for us it's a test case of what does it look like to go into a country where we're able to use English as a launch pad while we begin to assess where do we need to then look at of what languages could we strategically then pinpoint to advance the work once we launch in English. So it's an experiment, and we're excited about it, but even as I met with them yesterday, we are ready to go and excited for the leaders. We'll be training about 40 leaders in October. And then one of the other exciting things for us is as we began praying through in the work that we've been doing in Latin America, there is an obvious country for us that's in South America that we just have an inability to do anything as it comes to training, and that's in Brazil, one of the largest countries in South America, well, the largest country in South America. And we're doing everything around it, but nothing in Brazil. And so through a relationship with Biblica, who does the New International Version of the Bible, they translated all of our pastor training workshops. We currently have a couple that we're paying to translate all the discipleship material. And so at the end of this year, beginning of next year, we'll begin discussions with partnership relationships that we have in Brazil about launching Foundations Global in Brazil next year. Really excited about that because Brazil, if you think about it in this context, whatever we're able to do in Brazil, the Brazilian passport is the most available passport in the world to go into parts of the world that you and I could never get into. Brazil has an unusual relationship with the majority of the world from how they receive people post-World War II. Because of that, countries that it would be illegal with my passport to go into, a Brazilian could get into freely. And so looking at it through a filter of not just the discipleship training that we would do with them, but how that could potentially be something that they could then expand it into parts of the world that I can't get access into. So really excited about that strategic opportunity and praying for us getting the translation of the material That's the easy part. Figuring out the right places to launch it and finding the right partnerships is what we're praying through.
That's great. Well, doing these conversations and kind of catching up on the last however many months and then casting vision for the future, there's a lot there. And what I'm hopeful is that we'll be able to do more touch points like this in the future so that we can kind of even narrow in a little bit more specifically on these individual locations and these individual I guess projects. I can't think of another.
Yeah, no, that's true.
There you go. Focus more specifically in on them. Before we before we sign off here, I have one question. Is there, you've shared a couple stories here or there, but is there one story that might stick out over the course of the last several months that just says, you know what, Dave, when you said that, this popped to the top of my head of just God working, God doing his thing, God showing his providence. Is there anything that comes to the surface that you could just say, if you want to know what God's doing, this story does it. This story tells, this instance tells that story.
Yeah, for sure. I'm going to go back to a little bit. I talked about Luis a little bit, the young leader in Mexico City. Mm-hmm. And Luis is a really interesting story because his degree is in accounting. His father owns a rather large accounting firm in Mexico City, and yet Luis is wrestling with this tug in his heart that he feels like God is leading him towards ministry. When I look at Luis, what I realize is three things. Number one is that Luis is a young global leader that is got a vision of how God has transformed his life, how God's transformed his family. He was, through his aunt, came to faith and saw his family come to faith after he gave his life to Christ. And so in this, to me, it's amazing that when I look at how God is working, we get the opportunity to be a safe place for Luis to begin starting dialogues and conversation. Yeah. Think about this. There's this wonderful thing. I know that in the context of the United States, people think that Facebook's on its way out. I hate to break it to you people, but Facebook is the global domination force of international communication. Between that and WhatsApp, there is a huge segment of my ministry that are these young leaders that we have these conversations over WhatsApp and over Messenger that allows room for them to begin to say, how do I explore this with a neutral party that is not, I don't have a dog in the hunt. If Luis goes into vocational ministry, God's going to use him. If Luis doesn't go into vocational ministry, God's going to use him.
Yes.
God's already using him. But I look at that. Secondly, Luis is going to be the person that we're going to be able to tap on the shoulder and say, Luis, you understand how we could more effectively reach young people in discipleship globally. And as we're beginning to engage him, he's throwing ideas at us that are going to help us to be able to say, not just through the lens of a white suburban North American in the U.S., mm-hmm. but from a Latino North American in Mexico that's 20 years plus younger than me, that's going to be able to help us understand how can we more effectively reach the young leader globally. That's huge.
Yes.
Because I can have ideas of how we can reach a young leader, but I'm turning 50 next year. Now, I may think I'm still young, but every morning my body reminds me I'm not quite as young as I used to be. So I look at that. But here's the third thing about Luis. Last time that we were there, Luis took us to an older part of Mexico City. So if you think of Mexico City as kind of the urban sprawl, but then you've got these smaller communities that make up Mexico City that it's like you step back into time where you're in the town square and here's the cathedral and here's the shops. And so we're in that community, and that's when it hits me. There are a million things that Luis could be doing, but he's spending time with us. Mm-hmm. Globally, it's the same, where people vote with their feet and they vote with their calendars. And so for us, those moments where I realize we have the opportunity to personally invest in him. So when I think of like, how do I get in and out of Mexico City? What I don't do is say, what's the least amount of time I could spend there? I think, how do I spend enough time that I put myself in proximity to a leader like Luis, that if he says, hey, do you want to grab dinner? Do you want to go grab a coffee? That there's room for the relationship with that young leader. When people invest financially, I'm grateful for that. But I'm telling you, there are a bunch of Luises out there that we also need people that are willing to prayerfully consider going to train. Mm-hmm. That there are a bunch of places around the world where somebody's like, yeah, but I'm not a pastor. You don't have to be a pastor to go train pastors. You just have to be a person that's committed to discipling people and is willing to go and do discipleship. So when you think of it in those terms, that if you're already living out discipleship in your life, we'd love to invite you to join our team, to receive some training, to go find these parts of the world that you could go invest in helping other global churches expand by reaching their communities more effectively. Would love to have that discussion with anybody that's interested.
I dig that. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. I love that you're signing off with that call right there, and I love that you answered the question of, well, I'm not a pastor, don't I have to be a pastor? Because it is one of those things that often becomes a hang-up. All of the internal baggage, all the internal junk that we have, thinking, can I even pre-qualify myself? It's like, no, like, have the conversation. Let's dialogue. Let's find the perfect place. And I love that that's where we're ending. If people want to follow you, if people want to hear more from you, if people want to follow up and ask more questions about what they've heard, what's the best way to get a hold of you? What's the best way for them to contact you?
So there's two ways. So one of the best gifts Sun Valley gave me as I left is go to supportmatt.com. And you can find out more and you can give to our ministry there. You also can click a contact link and it'll send me an email for us to get back in contact with you. If you can't remember that, supportmatt.com. I think that's about as easy as it gets. You can also email me at matt@developingworkers.com.
That's great. Matt, thanks so much for the time. Appreciate it. I'm looking forward to having our next conversation.
All right. Thanks, Dave. Have a great day.